The chatbot era was very brief, where everybody tried to build a chatbot. But I think today agents are essentially, as you said, first-class citizens. So as an example, a lot of enterprises were thinking of, hey, we have, let's say, insurance policies or healthcare data, and let's try to build a chatbot that can answer going through all of these. But the conversation has moved to, hey, how do we build actual claim processing or revenue cycle management using agents?
Welcome to the Talking AI podcast, where we talk AI with both experts in the field and early adopters. I'm your host, Matt Paige, and we're here to demystify AI for you so you can get some value from it. Let's talk some AI. Every company building AI right now is asking the same question. If the models keep getting better and anyone can access them, what actually makes us defensible? And it's the question that keeps founders up at night and the one that determines where billions in venture capital get deployed. And today's guest writes those checks. Avi Bharadwaj is an investment director at Untitled Capital, where he focuses on the software infrastructure layer of AI. The company's building the tools, the platforms, and the systems that sit between the frontier models and the enterprise applications running on top of them. And he's backed companies like Scale AI, Bria, TrueFoundry, and 12 Labs. And he's got a front row seat to the questions that define this entire era that we're living in right now. When AI can do nearly everything, where does the moat actually live? But Avi, welcome to Talking AI.
Thanks, Matt. Great to be here.
Yeah, and I'm excited for this chat because we have not had somebody on the VC side on the podcast yet. So I'm really interested in this perspective coming in because it's one I think a lot of people are very interested in with the dynamics in the market and everything going on. But I want to start with the big question everyone in tech is wrestling with. So the frontier models, like we say, keep getting better, more general purpose, more capable. And the conventional wisdom is that moats are being just demolished in real time. But as someone who's writing checks in this space, putting money where your mouth is, where do you actually see defensibility showing up right now? And is it where you expected it 2 years ago when we started in this crazy Gen AI wave?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think it's a mistake to think that better models kill moats. In reality, I think what's happening is that they are commoditizing one layer of the puzzle. So as I'm sure most sophisticated software has multiple layers, the model being one of those layers, but there are many other important layers that make up an entire software platform. So what we are seeing is that defensibility or the focus on defensibility is shifting to these other layers. So let me talk about it in a bit more detail. Maybe I'll talk about the application layer companies first, and then I'll talk about infrastructure layer companies. At the application layer, I'd say data moats are still relevant. It's just different from what it was before. So previously, just more data was important. I think given when you were building your own models, you just had to get a lot of different data. But today it has shifted that not just more data, but more unique data is important. Frontier models, they are largely trained on publicly available data. So they have data on language and coding and reasoning and so on, but they don't have data that's proprietary to an enterprise. So think of, let's say, triggers within your CRM system or domain-specific data in areas like healthcare and legal and so on, and real-world data in infrastructure deployments or industrial settings. These frontier model companies don't have that. So startups that focus on these types of unique data sets, I think, still have the edge to be able to beat out these frontier models. Yeah. That's the first piece.
Keep going. Keep going on the different pieces. This is interesting.
Sure. Yeah. The second piece is what I would call workflow and system of action moat. So frontier model companies have pretty much standalone applications, right? Think of ChatGPT, think of Claude sitting on your desktop and so on. But they don't have the ability to build out detailed workflows within enterprises. So a lot of enterprise workflows need to touch multiple systems, and there are like 50 to 100 steps in some of these instances. And you need some rigid system to be able to do all this. And you typically won't rely on a very flexible tool that some of these frontier models come up with. So startups, I think, are focusing more on this workflow and becoming the system of action as opposed to just providing one tool. That's the second piece. The third piece is around user experience and product. So in the SaaS world, there was just a bunch of screens for everything, right? So your work had to adapt to how that software was built out. And that created a lot of silos, and data got segregated between these applications and so on. But with AI, startups have the ability to reimagine how work gets done. So there could be a lot of thinking how to improve outputs, how to personalize these systems for certain workflows, how to automate things better, and so on. So startups are focusing on that as well. The fourth bucket is around integration. So if you worked in a big enterprise, you know that there are 50 to 100 systems, both upstream and downstream from a specific task that you're doing. So how do you build integrations into all of these systems? And frontier model companies aren't interested, or they don't have the resources to be building all these integrations.
Quick break in the pod. If you're listening to this podcast, chances are you've been thinking about how to actually use AI inside your business. And that's exactly why we built the AI Opportunity Finder. It's a free tool that helps you uncover high impact, tailored AI use cases based on your business, your goals, your pain points, and your industry. No fluff, no generic use cases, just real ideas that fit your business, and they're ranked by ROI potential. It takes about 3 minutes to run, and it's like having your own personal AI strategist for free. If you want to try it for free, check out the link in the show notes or go to hatchworks.com/AI-opportunity-finder.
So startups have the ability or the gap to essentially go into this and build these integrations. And maybe lastly, on the application side is around trust and compliance. Enterprises care a lot about how to deploy applications safely and at scale. And they would be hesitant to essentially give their entire reins to a frontier model tool that employees can essentially use as they want. So there is some level of trust and compliance that startups can do to essentially win over enterprises. So these are on the application side, and I'll talk a little bit about infra side, but it's somewhat similar, so I'll go through that quickly. So on the infra layer, the ultimate thing is that models aren't the end goal. They're just one component of a bigger platform. So tools that help builders build these complex systems within enterprises. So those are the types of companies that I'm seeing and other VCs are investing in. So how do you help enterprises understand these workflows, understand internal data, leverage these feedback loops and create data flywheels and so on? So those are the types of enterprise companies that are winning. And in addition to building all this, you still need to evaluate, you still need to benchmark how things are performing, you need to make sure that security and identity are taken care of and so on. So those are still not in the purview of frontier models, if I may say so.
So for everybody listening, just take the transcript from this first part of the podcast, just feed it into Claude or ChatGPT, and you have your investment thesis to go see where everything's going. That was like, it's so great, but like data, workflows, taste, reimagining how work gets done, like super context rich right there. I'm curious that I don't know, a bit of an aside, but Jack Dorsey and Block, they cut 40% of their workforce recently, right? And they were one of the few people I think that actually came out with a thesis, a perspective on where the organization of the future is going. And he called it From Hierarchy to Intelligence. He put out this blog. I don't know if you saw it recently, it's in the past couple weeks, but it was literally this morning, I was watching this video from YC and they were going deep into this. But the reason I ask, I'm curious your thoughts on not only the things companies are building, their products, their services, but like the company themselves, because in the YC article, I'll just kind of quickly hit the high points, and I'm curious your take for both startups and existing enterprises. But they hit on AI. It's not just a tool, but it should be the operating layer, like an intelligence layer that companies have, having closed loops within your company. Because many times today, you have a lot of open loops. An input goes in and then something happens, and then you don't actually have the feedback loop that comes back in. But with AI, like you literally can build that system in, and it's a system that's self-improving in a sense. And then making the company queryable was the other thing they talked about, where you could basically ask a question of anything and AI has context of your entire organization. And they talk about the human middleware and token maxing and all this stuff. But I'm curious your thoughts on this from the org perspective. And you're typically looking at more startups, newer companies, so they're not having to deal with all the bloat. But any thoughts on this hypothesis that's starting to emerge?
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of the big takeaways around being able to do more with fewer people, being able to build products that have a faster feedback loop, as opposed to in the previous version, I think a lot of time got spent collecting data, labeling data, building proprietary machine learning models. I was a data scientist before I became a VC.
Oh, really?
And and a big chunk of the work was essentially cleaning data, getting data, labeling data, and so on. And even after you did all of that stuff, you got a fairly reasonable model, not the best model. But the difference today is that frontier models are essentially, because they're commoditizing intelligence, any developer anywhere in the world can immediately get access to the best model out there, right? So they can essentially embed intelligence or the top of the state-of-the-art intelligence into their products. And that allows them to start at a different footing than what they would have started a few years ago. So all the additional gains that they get from that point is through, as I said, unique data, workflow, and so on. But they're just starting from a different point than what they would have done a few years ago.
Yeah, it's funny. So I used to work on a team of data scientists. I did not have the PhD in data science, but I was the conduit of pulling out the insights and the analytics and things like that. And this was before generative AI existed. And I used to always notice there was like this invisible wall between what everyday humans could do and what PhD data scientists could do. And they were just doing these amazing things, but I also noticed the speed at which they did them was very slow, right? It's just completely different now. What data scientist as a role, how do you think that's evolving out of curiosity? 'Cause there's still tons of value, but is it different in your opinion
Right.
from where it was pre-generative AI to now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the way I would think about it is the work of a data scientist there was a lot of grunt work. And this, again, data scientist, data engineer, I think there are multiple roles that sort of blend into each other. So they had to do a lot of this grunt work on getting data, cleaning data, building models, testing, and a lot of those models would be useless and they had to throw it out. And then the other aspect was they had to build models for things that are pretty trivial today, like a
Yeah.
sentiment analysis model or classification model and
Mhm.
so on. They had to do all that by hand. Whereas today, they can focus on higher value work because when all of these sort of basic things that are common across companies are getting commoditized in the model layer, you can focus on building higher value models. You can focus on things that sort of get you from the 80 threshold to closer to 100, right? So I think it is definitely interesting. I've talked to a lot of my data scientist friends, and they're really energized by the fact that they don't need to do a lot of the grunt work. Most of the data pipeline work can be automated today, and they're spending more of their time on higher value work, which I think is great for everyone.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing there is that's true for any role out there, right? Because I
Mhm.
think engineers are at the forefront of everything. It's the canary in the coal mine, but literally this can be applied to any function in
Right.
business. I just think it's going to take time for people that are less technical to realize that. But I love seeing that aha moment in people's minds where they're like, "Oh, wait, I can do that." And then it starts to trigger a million other things they can do in a sense. But what
Right.
it's actually a good segue there, a good question. Within your own company, like Intel is obviously massive. Intel Capital's, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a smaller subsidiary or piece of Intel. But like, how are you all leveraging AI in your business? Any unique
Yeah.
instances or examples, use cases of AI? I think the audience loves hearing, okay, how are the guests actually using AI in their business, in their personal life, in their personal day to day within their work life?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been using AI for more than a couple of years now, and it's evolved pretty rapidly based on newer tools coming out. So at a high level, the job of a VC is, I can classify it in four buckets. So it's seeing, it's picking, it's winning, and supporting. So seeing is essentially making sure you're seeing all the startups in your focus area.
Mhm.
Picking is like doing the due diligence and making sure you invest in the right companies. Winning is how do you compete with others who also want to invest in these companies? How do you make sure that the startup takes your money versus someone else's money?
Mhm.
And then supporting is once you've made the investment, how do you do portfolio governance? How do you help your founders achieve whatever is great for everyone? So given this workflow, I've seen a lot of AI adoption both on my side, our team side as well, and broadly in the industry in the seeing and picking. So that's the first two buckets. I think the winning and supporting is more ad hoc and more hands-on as opposed to seeing and picking. So in the seeing and picking buckets, we use a lot of tools like Claude Cowork, I use AlphaSense, we use Affinity, and a bunch of other early stage products. So I'll give you a couple of examples on how I use these. So being an infra investor, I spend a lot of my time reading research papers, technical blogs, hacker news, Reddit threads,
Yeah.
Discord channels, and so on. So that used to be a pretty big time sink. Even if you're a fast reader, it takes a lot of time to digest all that's coming out today. Now I have an agent on Claude Cowork that goes through a lot of these threads, summarizes findings, identifies what companies are being talked about, looks them up on PitchBook, and then enters it directly into our CRM. And every morning I can go into it and I can see what new companies have emerged and what the conversation among the technical community is about these companies. So it's significantly reduced the amount of work that I have to put in to learn about some of these newer companies. In the picking side, again, I use Claude Cowork within Excel to help with modeling and analysis. So it used to take me hours to do some of the financial analysis.
Oh, I bet.
But it can be done in minutes today. So it's really quick
Yeah.
and pretty accurate. So I'm really excited about all these other tools that will help accelerate some of the work that I've been doing.
Yeah, it's funny. It's like things like that. You're just like, I think we're taking for granted how easy stuff's getting. Like we were doing our quarterly planning for Q2, and I'm sure you're used to this, many listeners as well. You do your quarterly planning, you got to look back at how the last quarter went, what happened. But this time around, I just fed all the data to Claude. I can't remember if I was using Cowork or Claude Code, whatever it was, but I fed all of our data. I connected it with our CRM, and I just said, hey, do a deep dive on the past quarter, any insights, and help me plan for next quarter. And it generated this amazing presentation, and it had a lot of nuanced takes that I wouldn't have gotten to myself, right? And I also had a
Right.
presentation that was ready to go in the meeting, which beforehand I would have spent a week formatting crap. And thinking back to the days of having to format a PowerPoint presentation, I will never go back there. But there's just so many examples there. I think part of the insight here for people listening is just start doing something, just start playing with it, because then you'll start to get more familiar with the tools. I think connectors are a massive thing with whatever tool you're using. Connect it to where your data lives, back to the point earlier you're mentioning around the data side of things. But yeah, I got like several ideas floating in my head in your industry specifically where you could apply AI, because at the end of the day, it's pattern matching. That's a key element
Right.
to what you do in essence. And AI
Absolutely.
is so good at pattern matching.
Absolutely. And I think, yeah, there are a lot of newer tools coming out as well, like OpenClaw, the whole autonomous agents and so on. I'm a bit hesitant to use it in my work setting. I've tried it on my personal machine, but I think as security and sort of trust improves, we'll start using a lot more of these tools within our workflow. But yeah, it's pretty fascinating how much of this can be automated. And to your point earlier, this will allow us to do more higher value things as opposed to, as you said, like fixing the PowerPoint presentation or doing things that are essentially grunt work.
Totally. And you've backed a lot of companies building specialized foundation models like video understanding with 12 Labs, image generation, Bria, time series robotics, all these different things. But I'm curious your take. There's some pundits out there that'll say, oh, this is just a head start. The frontier players, Claude and OpenAI, they'll drop some feature and it'll completely obliterate some company, or the market will have a massive reaction. We're seeing some of that in the markets. But what's like your take of like the hype versus reality when Claude Code does their latest announcement? I think the latest one is what Claude Design, and then I think it was Figma just was hurting the next day. But where do you see the hype versus reality, and how should people think about this on the market side of things?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's definitely possible for some types of specialized use cases to get subsumed by the bigger frontier model companies. Like one example is a couple of years ago, I think one of the prevailing wisdoms was that for coding, you needed a dedicated model that can do coding, right? So, and as it turns out today, you don't need that for most greenfield coding. You may still need that for some lower level coding, or you may need it for like code migration and a few use cases. But for most greenfield coding, I think it turns out that big generalized models are pretty good there. But I feel like there are still areas where specialized foundation models can be helpful. I think your question had two aspects. One was around specialized foundation models, and the other was around what happens if a tool like Claude Design comes out affecting something like Figma, right? So on the specialized model side, I feel like there are certain fundamental things that make certain areas pretty attractive for specialized models. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So one is with unique data sets, again, going back to data. Like our portfolio company, Bria, for example, only trains on licensed images with the permission of the license holder. So they cannot violate people's copyrights. And there is a universe of customers that cares a lot about this.
Yeah.
So that's the universe that would use something like a Bria model. And another portfolio company of ours is Field AI, which trains on live deployments in industrial sites, which none of the frontier model companies are doing today, right? So it's a very unique type of data set that they're getting. The second angle is around unique model approaches. So as I'm sure most of the big frontier model companies are trained on standard transformer-based LLMs. But there are other approaches like state space machines or hybrids like Jamba and so on that could be better for use cases like edge devices because they are low memory or they are energy efficient or they can do real-time inference and so on. So there is that niche where big model providers won't change their entire architecture to fix this use case. So it's a fundamentally different approach. And then the third bucket could be like unit economics. Like there are lots of use cases where frontier models can do a good job, but the cost per token is so high that it may not make sense to use these big generalized models. I was talking to a startup recently, and they use a model called the segment anything model to pick out checkboxes from PDFs. So apparently, they have better accuracy and they have a lower cost as opposed to using a big frontier model, right? So I think we see the world moving towards having dozens or tens of different foundation, like specialized foundation models for different use cases. And like I said before, the trick is in building big platforms in which models are only one component. Like you would use one or a handful of models, but there would be other layers in the stack that would make it pretty sophisticated. So I think that's our view on generally specialized foundation models. And your question on Figma, I think, is really interesting. Thankfully, the private market companies don't gyrate like quite closely with public market stock. Otherwise, it would have been crazy to manage our investment thesis. So we need to have our investment thesis needs to be looking out 5, 10 years out and thinking about what will happen in the medium to long term. But there are trends, I think, that vary based on what's happening in the public markets. So you have to take that into account. So again, this goes back to a lot of what I already said, which is, and this is not an original thought that I've had, but a lot of smart people have said this, is that try to build things that improve as model improves. Don't try to build things that sort of fit the gap of, hey, the model companies are doing these things, but they can't do, let's say, A, B, or C. So let's try to fit that gap because that gap is an ever shrinking gap. You will get outbid pretty quickly. I think that's the first part. And the second maybe part of this answer is that most of the use cases that the big frontier model companies have won to date have been somewhat standalone, right? If you look at coding, it's a bottoms-up adoption type of thing. Like individual developers adopt it and start using it. Same with design, like it's a single tool that a single designer can start using. But the model companies have not been able to crack some of the bigger, broader, top-down adoption type use cases, like in legal tech or like within CRMs or within compliance and so on. And the vast majority of enterprise use cases are these types, like where you need someone senior to adopt it or to champion the adoption, and then it flows down, top down. And to be able to do that, you need all the things that I talked about. You need integrations, you need workflow complexity, you need compliance and trust, you need all these other things outside of just model capability. So I think, those are the things that I think about a lot, that I think other VCs think about a lot, and the startups we invest in think about a lot as well.
I love that. It's so nuanced in terms of this perspective, especially on the specialized model side. That makes a ton of sense. But like the specialized workflow side that you mentioned just now and earlier too, like I think of a product like 11 Labs, not 12 Labs, but 11 Labs. I use it a lot for voice related things, but the benefit of using that is they have this entire system built that's tailored to voice interactions. Like they have their own like kind of workflow management thing working with that, all of the different variables that you can include and whatnot. But also the other thing is just how easy it is to work with whatever you're using, Claude Code, Lovable, Codex, and you can directly connect with 11 Labs, right? And just build whatever you're building. So there's almost this element of being easy to work with other tools, especially some of the frontier tools. And the other element too is I think just making it easy for AI and agents especially to use your tools. Like Salesforce the other day came out with their headless solution. I forget the name headless was in it somewhere. I forget the exact name, but thoughts on that from an agentic perspective and actually treating like AI and agents as a first class user that you're considering when you're building out a product on your roadmap and whatnot.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there has been quite a drastic shift in a quick couple of years from just having chatbots that could provide good answers to deeply embedded vertical workflows, right? So I think the chatbot era was very brief, where everybody tried to build a chatbot. But I think today agents are essentially, as you said, first-class citizens. So as an example, a lot of enterprises were thinking of, hey, we have, let's say, insurance policies or healthcare data, and let's try to build a chatbot that can answer going through all of these. But the conversation has moved to, hey, how do we build actual claim processing or revenue cycle management using agents? And the shift essentially on the infra layer is that agents are similar to humans in many ways, but they're different from humans in a
Yeah.
lot of ways. Like you need to be able to build memory, you need to be able to understand how context works for these agents. The speed of execution is very different. The whole search ecosystem is built for humans who are essentially reading at maybe 5 tokens per second to agents who can read at hundreds of tokens per second. So how do you enable agentic action there, I think is important as well. And reinforcement learning within an enterprise. So agents may have skills through the LLMs, like generic skills, but they may not have specific skills within an enterprise as to why would you approve a certain claim versus deny a certain claim and so on. So there are techniques within reinforcement learning that are helping improve that. So I think these are a few areas of changes that I have seen from moving from, let's say, a chatbot type activity to more of an agentic experience. And the headless CRM that Salesforce released and you talked about is essentially one example of the change that we are seeing. I think we'll see a lot more of these. We'll see most of the application companies that have web portals for humans to look into. I think they will have some sort of a headless version for agents to work with as well, so that they can improve the speed and accuracy.
Yeah, totally. Because I don't know if anybody's actually ever used like a browser use tool and you've seen an agent moving around on your screen. It looks like they're drunk half the time because it's just not. It's not built for an agent. The agent's just give me a dang API and let me just get to the data I want and do the job. But it, like totally makes
Right.
sense. And one thing I want to go back to, you mentioned memory. Like one use case I have, you mentioned one's kind of similar, but I have a daily brief where it's connected to my email, my Slack, my CRM, my granola for my meeting notes, all these things. But an element I built into it, it's just Claude Code, an agent running on a routine effectively that triggers every morning, but it has memory as a component of it. So it's not giving me the same stuff every time. If it sees that I've missed some critical thing 3 days in a row, it's saying, hey, I've told you to do this a couple of times, you still haven't done it. So there's that element there. And I've also been playing with, if you've done this, but Andres Karpathy's new LLM wiki, effectively. It's like a different
Right. I've
form
seen
of
it, but I
RAG.
haven't played around with it.
So
Yeah.
I've done that too. But the beauty is like you can just take his gist and give it to Claude Code and say, hey, set this up for me and get working. But that
Right.
has been really interesting in terms of having this self-improving system that's learning over time. And it's, I think, a really interesting way of, it's almost like storing and connecting and aggregating data in kind of an efficient way versus the more traditional. It's funny we're calling RAG traditional, but the RAG approach in a sense. But it's, I don't know, any thoughts on just memory in general? I feel like memory, which is a form of context, is just so important when it comes to AI.
Absolutely. I think there are what I would call different types of memory. So, of course, there is stuff like what you talked about, which is around session-based memory.
Yep.
What did you ask? What was what was the response back, and was that good or bad? So, I think that's probably slightly ephemeral. Then there is medium to long-term memory on what did you ask previously? What was the context of all of these questions? How can that be tied together historically, and so on? And then there is, sort of broader, and these two are essentially individual memory contexts, right? This is you and your chatbot working together, but expand that more broadly into, let's say, a team of 30 claims adjudicators within an insurance company, where they need to standardize this memory. You shouldn't allow one person's idiosyncrasies to impact broadly what happens. So how do you architect memory for some of these broader use cases, right? How do you encapsulate what enterprises do in terms of like why things get approved or denied or what happens next in a certain workflow? How do you encapsulate all of that within memory? So I think these are really interesting problems where there are like very companies at very early stages to answer some of these, but essentially capturing this memory and making it usable in a bigger and broader setting with multiple people and multiple workflows, I think is where a lot of the challenges are.
Yeah. I've noticed this interesting pattern too, where People, it's like you have to be careful not to like over architect or be too directive with AI sometimes, because sometimes its own feedback loop of whatever data is coming back in is enough for the system to self improve. Obviously, you got to give it direction, but you can also go too far where you're too descriptive, deterministic in your nature. I don't know. Any thoughts on this kind of dance between probabilistic, which is the LLM, and deterministic, which is traditional software?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's changing very rapidly.
Yeah.
Like, even a year ago, prompt engineering was a big thing, right? Like your answer depended on how you phrase the question, or like a
Yeah.
couple of extra words or fewer words completely changed how things worked. And I think all of that is gone. Today, it's most of these models are pretty resilient. They're able to answer regardless of how you ask the question. But having said that, I think there is still some level of design thinking or system architecture thinking that needs to go into context engineering, like what needs to, like how do you think of these systems? Because many people who come from the traditional software engineering paradigm make this mistake of essentially trying to use models like a very long if-else statement loop, right?
Yeah.
If this, do this, if
Yeah.
this, do this, and so on. And I feel like that sort of somewhat restricts the model, and it doesn't fully make the model capable of whatever it's capable of. So I think there is definitely this trade-off that people have to evaluate. And it is harder because the more rope you give to this model, the better guardrails you need to build into it, the better evaluation metrics and benchmarking metrics you need to build into it. So I feel like there is a whole new software engineering systems architecture paradigm that's emerging because of all these complexities. And I think, yeah, in a few years, this will become a discipline of its own where
Totally.
all of these things will have certain rules as to how do you create these contexts, how do you evaluate these contexts, and so on. So I definitely think that it will become a pretty well-defined discipline in a couple of years or so.
It's funny. I'm finding the people that it's like those that the architects, those that really know how systems work. They think in systems. Like even the book, I'd always reference Thinking in Systems, the name of the book.
Mhm.
But people that understand stuff at that kind of conceptual level, so much of that applies to when you're thinking about working with AI in a sense, and like the incentives and all the different feedback loops and things that you're building in there. It's like you got to get to that level of thinking. I think it's super powerful in a sense. But so
Right.
curious on the multimodal side, easy for me to say, but Intel Capital has a thesis around specialized foundation models we were talking about earlier, robotics, multimodal, things like that. But where do you think like the next major breakout category is, and what modalities are you most excited about? Like, for instance, we had on the podcast the CTO of Osmo. I don't know if you've heard of them, but they're teaching AI how to smell effectively, which
Interesting.
blew my mind because that was that one modality I just didn't think was going to be touched. But I still remember this use case. They talk about they can identify counterfeit goods like a Louis Vuitton handbag or a Nike tennis shoe by the smell of it, which is essentially just the chemical nature of the good. And it goes to the products being made, the glues, the things like that. But go into the modality, multimodal side of things. What
Yeah.
excites you most there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think on a personal side, I'm really excited about and looking forward to world models. I feel like we're at the very early stages
Yeah.
of building world models and building usable world models. The way I see it is that a language is a way to abstract the complexity of the real world. So everything that you can see and feel and touch and smell today like gets translated into language and then essentially gets codified or abstracted into a model. And a lot is lost in that translation, right? Because you are essentially simplifying all that you're seeing, all your senses are perceiving. But world models, I think, hopefully will be able to open up something that's currently not possible with this level of abstraction. And the most interesting aspect of this that I'm looking forward to is emergent abilities. As I'm sure you've seen with LLMs, no one expected LLMs to be good at reasoning or good at coding or other things. But as it turns out, the bigger models that you build, there are these emergent properties around reasoning and so on that just emerge without actually training for it specifically. So I'm really curious to see what happens with world models as you build bigger and bigger world models. Does it just understand causality? Does it understand what happens next in the world around you, and the sort of laws of nature encoded in some of these things that get emerged as part of the emergent property? So I'm really curious to learn about that. And lastly, I'd say one of the recent trends has been not just a single new modality, but marrying multiple multimodal things together. So it could be like a combination of perception meets sensing meets action. So think of, let's say, a robot that just perceives its environment, it like figures out what needs to be done, it reasons it, and goes and takes the action as well. So I feel like those would be putting multiple models together to build these bigger systems are what's super exciting for me.
Yeah, that's spot on. I think anybody that has not seen Google's world model, they have some videos out about it, but it's just wild in terms of building this world that you can interact with. I got two questions for you. First one, are we in base reality or are we in some other kind of world model? I'd be curious there. And I'll hit you with the second one after you do that.
Again, I'm not really sure if it's based reality or some other world model. I feel like it's probably a personal taste. Some people would prefer one versus the other. But yeah, I'd probably like to see simulated world models or simulated worlds and see how that happens as well. But I think, yeah, it's definitely a personal preference.
Yeah. And so on the robotics side, you mentioned that. And I think it's a great point because you see these robotics companies coming out and it's really connecting all the different things that you see in AI into this embodied state. But I'd be curious, what is your thought on the robotics? Like, when do you think that will hit mainstream? Because you see the videos out there and you're like, oh my gosh, this thing could be Rosie Jetson tomorrow. And then you see some other videos where they're just completely failing at basic tasks. What's your thought on the world of robotics now that they're embedded with AI and all these different modalities we've been talking about?
Yeah. So I think at a high level, I think anything I say will be wrong because of how quickly things are changing. So I think it's extremely hard to predict. But what I do see is that just the rapid pace of innovation is pretty incredible. So there are like maybe two angles to this. One is there are most of the sort of really well-funded robotics companies today, they're taking the approach of let's make these robots or the robotic models extremely competent. Let's get them to do a lot of things or make them extremely generically sophisticated and so on. And the other angle is to say, hey, let's minimize what they can do. Let's just focus on robots that, let's say, fold clothes, for example, or like you may have seen some of these demos from CES or so on, where robots are really good at, let's say, playing table tennis and so on. So they're, on the one hand, they're trying to limit the scope of what the robots can do, but doing those really well. On the other hand, you're trying to see some of these generic models that are essentially going the approach of OpenAI or Anthropic, where they want to build these big generic models. So I feel like we'll probably start seeing examples on the second one, which is like narrow use cases, but more useful use cases. But I think these will most likely be in the industrial setting or where the degrees of freedom are fewer.
Yeah.
For you and I, like on a personal level, like living the life of Jetsons, for example, I think is probably a bit farther out because just the cost versus the risk of failure is pretty high. You don't want a robot in your house, maybe potentially destroying something. So I think it'll take some time for it to get there. My guess would be within the next 10 years, but I could be off. But definitely within the next 10 years. But then the question is around unit economics. Like how much would it cost to get one of these robots? Would you be willing to pay $20,000, $30,000, $50,000 to have one of these robots do most of your household chores? And after that, what does the sort of decay curve look like for the cost of having these robots at home, right? So I think those are some of the questions that are interesting.
Yeah, it reminds me of self-driving cars 10 years ago or so. You're like, oh my gosh, this is going to be out mainstream next year, but there's like edge cases that emerge and there's nuance to it. And I guess the difference is we have generative AI, so maybe it accelerates things like it's accelerating everything else. But I got to go back to the beginning. So you were a data scientist and now you're a VC. How did you make the jump from data scientist to VC? What drove you to do that? What's the story behind it?
Yeah, absolutely. I have an engineering background. I studied electronic engineering in undergrad. I studied information sciences in grad school. I was a full stack engineer for a number of years at Goldman. Then I was a data scientist at IBM for a few years. So I think what I really liked is the sort of constant intellectual curiosity aspect of the job that I had, like working deep in technical details and so on. But I wanted to work with early stage startups, but not with one startup, right? I wanted to still have this intellectual curiosity of moving from problem to problem or learning from the cutting edge of whatever is happening across the board. And coincidentally, a fund at that time was looking for someone with my background because they were seeing a lot of technical data science heavy companies and they wanted someone with my background to help analyze those companies. And I think VC is one of these careers where you'll see people from so many backgrounds. You'll see former product managers, you'll see investment bankers, management consultants, founders,
Operators.
right? So I think unlike, operators, exactly. So unlike, let's say, private equity or other areas of finance, venture is a space where people from having this diversity of backgrounds is really helpful because you're pattern matching to an extent, but you're also looking at things where there is no pattern, right? I think, that was essentially the transition. And it's been 12 years and I've really enjoyed it. I've enjoyed being the sidekick to some of the smartest people out there.
Yeah. Anybody looking for another good podcast, 20 VC is a good VC one, which frankly, like 90% of the episodes now are just all AI based. But what's the coolest thing about being a VC and the most overrated thing about being a VC?
The coolest thing about being a VC is, as I said, you get this front row seat across a bunch of different founders who are all building amazing things. Where you like 1 week, you're learning a lot. If you have intellectual curiosity, I think you can learn a lot. I think the part of the job is essentially learning about new cool stuff that's happening in the world. So I think that's probably the coolest thing. And of course, working with the founders who are making it happen. The most overrated, I'd probably say, is that VCs decide a lot of things or whatever the expectation may be, which I don't think is true. I think at best, VCs are sidekicks for founders who can help them achieve their goals. And at worst, I think they become detractors, like lots of VCs. And I try my best to not be a detractor. I try to support founders as much as possible. But the power that a lot of people ascribe to VCs, I think, is definitely overrated. Like most VCs aren't as powerful as one would think.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Yeah, sometimes you can be helpful in the wrong way. In a sense, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Avi, it's been great having you on Talking AI. I love the nuanced perspective from the VC world and that lens that you're viewing everything. But where can people find you? Where can they learn more about Intel Capital? Let us know.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm on Twitter, I'm on LinkedIn. We publish a lot of our thought pieces on Intel Capital's blog. Feel free to reach out on any of those avenues.
Awesome. Avi, thank you for talking some AI with us today.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me, Matt.
Thanks for listening to the Talking AI podcast. If you enjoyed the show, give us a follow or subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. And don't forget to leave us a review. We love those. For more info on Talking AI, visit talkingaipodcast.com. Quick break in the pod. Our State of AI 2026 report just dropped, and it breaks down what actually is changing in AI, what's hype, and what leaders need to be paying attention to this year. You can grab it right now in our show notes or at hatchworks.com.